I didn't realize my marriage had already started collapsing until the night my husband accidentally exposed the one truth he had spent years ignoring. It happened in a restaurant. A quiet, elegant place called Bel Air, the kind of restaurant where the lighting is soft enough to make everyone look successful, and the wine list is longer than most people's resumes. Daniel had insisted on hosting dinner for my team. At the time, I assumed it was simply his attempt to be supportive. For years, he had been the quiet husband standing slightly behind me at corporate events. The polite man who held my coat, smiled for photos, and patiently listened to conversations about marketing strategy he never seemed to fully understand. So when he said, "Why don't we have dinner at Bel Air with your team?" I thought it was sweet, maybe even overdue. That night, I walked into the restaurant feeling completely in control. My boss was there, my colleagues, and Garrett, the rising strategist everyone in the company seemed impressed with lately. Everything about the evening looked perfect. The wine pairings, the private staff, the flawless presentation. For the first 30 minutes, the dinner unfolded exactly the way I wanted it to. I led the conversation. I introduced people. I steered the topics, just like I did at every professional event. Then the restaurant manager approached the table. He looked directly at my husband first, not at me. Not at my boss, at Daniel. "Your private table upstairs is ready whenever you prefer, ma'am," he said politely. For a moment, I assumed I misheard him. "My what?" I asked. He smiled again, slightly confused. "Your private mezzanine table, Miss Sterling. It's prepared exactly the way you requested." The entire table went silent. My boss slowly turned toward Daniel. Someone asked a quiet question about Bel Air's ownership group. Another colleague mentioned the investors who had saved the restaurant years ago after the fire. And that was when the room shifted. Because my quiet, forgettable husband, the man I had introduced for years as someone who dabbled in small hospitality investments, calmly took a sip of wine and said something that completely changed the way everyone looked at him. I was one of the founding investors who kept Bel Air from shutting down. No arrogance, no drama. Just a simple statement. But in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The man sitting across from me wasn't the man I thought I married. And even worse, everyone at the table had just discovered that I had no idea who my own husband really was. I'm Victoria Sterling. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've lived by one rule. If you can control the narrative, you can control the outcome. That mindset is why I climbed as fast as I did in brand partnerships, why my bosses trusted me with high-stakes accounts, why my team followed my direction even when the work was brutal, and why people in my industry used words like polished, driven, untouchable when they described me. But that same mindset is also why my marriage ended up becoming a performance. Daniel and I met in the least glamorous way imaginable. A fundraiser I attended out of obligation, not passion. My company was sponsoring part of the event, and I'd been sent there to network meaningfully, which was corporate code for smile, collect business cards, and pretend you care about everyone's nonprofit story. Daniel wasn't working the room. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was standing near the silent auction table, studying a framed photograph like it actually mattered, not like it was just a tax write-off with a nice caption. I remember thinking he looked calm, like he didn't need anything from anyone. When I made a joke about the auction items being overpriced, he smiled, small, controlled, and said, "That's the point. People aren't paying for the object. They're paying to be seen paying." It was one of the first times a man had said something to me that didn't feel like flirting or posturing. It felt like observation, intelligence without desperation. We talked for almost an hour about cities, about architecture, about travel, about food. He had a way of listening that made me feel like my words were actually landing somewhere, not just floating in the air until the next person spoke. He didn't ask for my number right away. He didn't push. He just said, "If you ever want a quiet dinner that isn't about networking, I know a place." I said yes, partly because I was intrigued, partly because I was tired of men who treated me like a trophy they wanted to win. Daniel wasn't like that. At least, not on the surface. We dated for 2 years before we got married, And during those 2 years, I learned what everyone around me quickly noticed too. Daniel was stable. He remembered small things, how I took my coffee, what kind of music calmed me down before presentations, the fact that I hated being touched when I was stressed. He never competed with my ambition. He never acted threatened by my success. He didn't complain when I worked late. He didn't guilt me when I had to cancel plans. When I talked about promotions, he didn't give me lectures about balance. He just asked, "What do you need from me?" That kind of support felt like love, and maybe it was. But looking back, I can see the moment our dynamic quietly solidified into something unhealthy. It happened when my first startup attempt failed. I'd left a comfortable job to build something bigger, something that would finally prove I wasn't just good at executing other people's visions. I was capable of building my own. It crashed. Hard. I came home crying, furious, blaming investors, blaming timing, blaming the entire market. Daniel didn't judge me. He held me while I unraveled. He poured me wine. He told me I wasn't a failure, and I clung to him after that. Not just emotionally, practically. He became the quiet foundation underneath my life while I rebuilt. And somewhere in that rebuilding, I started treating him like infrastructure. Something reliable, something permanent. Something that didn't require curiosity. I never asked too many questions about his work because he never made it a big deal. He said he preferred private projects. He said he liked staying low-key. He said he wasn't interested in being publicly visible, and that fit perfectly into the image I was building for myself. In my world, visibility mattered. Titles mattered. Influence mattered. Daniel was my calm contrast, the supportive husband, the man in the background. And because he never demanded the spotlight, I stopped checking whether he was standing in shadows by choice or because I had placed him there. My colleagues knew him as the polite guy who showed up at charity galas, smiled in photos, and waited while I networked. My boss once joked, "Daniel's the dream. Quiet, agreeable, doesn't compete." I laughed like it was a compliment. I didn't realize how cruel that sounded until much later, especially after that night at Bel Air, when the entire room looked at my husband like he was someone powerful, and looked at me like I was the woman who didn't even know the person she slept next to. Because the truth is, Daniel hadn't changed overnight. I had just never bothered to look closely enough to see who he really was. Looking back now, the signs were there long before the dinner at Bel Air. Not dramatic signs. Not the kind that explode into arguments or broken plates. Just small shifts in gravity. The kind you only notice once everything has already started tilting. At the time, I was focused almost entirely on my career. My agency had just started landing larger brand accounts, and I had quietly positioned myself as the person most likely to take the next promotion to Executive Director of Brand Partnerships. That promotion meant visibility. It meant leadership. It meant the kind of authority that changes how rooms react when you walk in. So naturally, my attention was consumed by work. Daniel didn't complain. He rarely did. If anything, he seemed amused by the chaos of my schedule. "You've been on 3 calls before breakfast," he said once, leaning against the kitchen counter while I rushed through emails. "That's the job," I replied without looking up. He smiled slightly. "I know." That was the thing about Daniel. He never fought for attention. And because of that, I stopped noticing how much space I was taking. Meanwhile, my office environment was shifting in ways that felt exciting at the time. That was when Garrett joined the firm. Garrett Lawson was everything agencies love in a rising strategist. Confident, sharp, effortlessly charismatic. He had that kind of polished energy that makes clients feel like they're already winning just by listening to him talk. Within 2 months, he was everywhere. Leading pitches, presenting campaign concepts, turning casual brainstorming sessions into theatrical performances that impressed senior leadership. I remember telling Daniel about him one night while we were eating dinner. "Garrett absolutely destroyed the pitch today," I said, laughing as I scrolled through my phone. "The client practically applauded." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Destroyed the pitch? You know what I mean," I said. He nodded slowly. "I'm sure he's impressive." I didn't notice the slight pause before he spoke. At the time, Garrett just felt like a colleague who made work more exciting. We started collaborating frequently. Late brainstorming sessions, strategy meetings that ran long, team dinners after successful presentations. My phone started lighting up with messages at odd hours. Garrett, quick thought about tomorrow's campaign angle. Garrett, do you think the client will go for the lifestyle approach? Garrett, still awake? Had an idea. Nothing inappropriate. At least, not obviously. But there was a tone to those conversations, a lightness, a playful energy. It reminded me of how Daniel and I used to talk when we first met. At home, subtle things began changing. Daniel stopped asking as many questions about my day, not in a resentful way, just less curiosity. If I mentioned Garrett, Daniel would nod politely and change the subject. I assumed he simply wasn't interested in office politics. What I didn't realize was that he had started paying closer attention than I thought. Meanwhile, I was slowly drifting further into the world I cared about most. Industry events, client dinners, networking parties where reputation mattered as much as results. Daniel still came when I asked him to. He stood beside me in photographs, shook hands, smiled, but he rarely inserted himself into conversations anymore. Once, after a charity gala, I joked in the car ride home, "You're the quietest husband in the room at these things." He glanced out the window before answering. "Someone has to be." I laughed. I thought he was teasing. I didn't realize he was describing exactly how invisible he had become in my life. And while I was busy building my professional momentum, something else was quietly forming in the background. Not just distance between me and Daniel, but a different kind of closeness between me and Garrett. It started with harmless jokes, then shared glances during meetings, then the kind of casual touches that are easy to dismiss if no one calls attention to them. A hand brushing an arm, standing slightly closer than necessary. Lingering conversations after everyone else had left the room. None of it looked like betrayal yet. Not clearly, not definitively, but if someone had asked me then whether the balance in my marriage was shifting, I probably would have said no, because I believed Daniel would always be there, steady, patient, waiting in the background of my life. What I didn't realize was that while I was chasing the spotlight, Daniel had quietly stepped into rooms I didn't even know existed. And the night at Bel Air was the first time those two worlds finally collided. The night everything cracked open didn't begin with suspicion. It began with a gala. Those kinds of charity events blur together after a while. Soft lighting, violin quartets playing somewhere near the entrance, champagne glasses clinking like background music, while executives congratulate each other for donating money that was carefully calculated for tax deductions. That evening was no different. I wore a black designer dress I'd been saving for a high-profile event. The kind of dress that photographs beautifully and signals confidence without looking like you're trying too hard. Daniel came with me, of course. He always did. He stood beside me while I greeted people, listened while I explained campaign strategies to clients who had already heard the same pitch 3 times that night, and smiled politely when someone inevitably asked him what he did for a living. That question always made the air feel slightly awkward, because Daniel's answers were vague. "I work on a few hospitality projects," he usually said. People nodded, assumed it meant something small, and quickly redirected their attention back to me. That night, Garrett was also there. He had joined our agency only months earlier, but he moved through the room like he'd been part of the industry for years. Clients liked him. My boss liked him. And lately, I had begun noticing how easily we slipped into conversations that had nothing to do with work. He approached with 2 glasses of champagne and handed one to me. "To surviving another quarter," he said with a grin. I laughed. "Barely." Daniel stood beside us quietly. Garrett turned toward him with the friendly confidence he used with everyone. "Daniel, right? I've heard Victoria mention you." Daniel shook his hand politely. "I hope only good things." Garrett smiled. "Mostly that you're the calm one in the relationship." Daniel chuckled softly. "That sounds accurate." The 3 of us stood there for a few minutes making small talk. Nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate. But I remember the moment something subtle shifted. Garrett leaned slightly closer while he was telling a story about a disastrous pitch meeting in Chicago. His shoulder brushed mine, just briefly. A tiny moment, but Daniel noticed. I could tell because his eyes flicked toward us, not sharply, just observantly. Then he looked away. At the time, I barely registered it. Later, that moment would replay in my mind more times than I could count. The rest of the evening continued the way these events always do. Speeches, donations, applause. Daniel eventually drifted toward the silent auction table, where he seemed far more interested in examining the items than talking to strangers. Meanwhile, Garrett and I kept circulating through the crowd. At one point, he leaned down slightly and said quietly, "Your husband seems like a patient guy." "He is," I replied. Garrett smiled. "Not every man would handle being married to someone this driven." I laughed it off. He's used to it. What I didn't realize was that Daniel was standing only a few feet away when Garrett said that, close enough to hear every word. Later that night, after the speeches ended and the crowd began thinning out, I found Daniel near the exit. "You ready?" I asked. He nodded. "Whenever you are." Garrett passed us on his way out and waved casually. "Great night," he said. "See you Monday." Daniel nodded politely. "Good night." There was nothing dramatic about the drive home. No confrontation. No raised voices. Just the quiet hum of the highway and the soft glow of city lights sliding past the windows. But something about the silence felt different. He wasn't angry. He wasn't distant. He was thinking. I could tell. Finally, halfway home, he spoke. "You and Garrett seem to work well together." His voice was calm. Too calm. I shrugged. "He's good at his job." Daniel nodded once. "That's obvious." I waited for something else. A complaint. A question. Anything. But he didn't say another word. When we got home, he poured himself a glass of bourbon and stood by the kitchen counter, staring into it like it held answers. "You're quiet tonight," I said. He glanced up. "Just tired." I accepted that explanation because I wanted to. Because questioning it would have required acknowledging something I wasn't ready to face. What I didn't realize then was that something had shifted inside him that night. Not anger, not jealousy, something colder, something more deliberate. Because while I went to bed believing my marriage was stable, Daniel was already beginning to look at our life with a completely different perspective. And within weeks, he would discover something that would change everything between us. Something neither of us would be able to take back. For a long time, I didn't realize Daniel had already started watching more carefully. From my perspective, life simply continued. Work accelerated. Garrett and I were placed on more projects together. My boss liked the results we produced when we collaborated. Clients liked our energy and presentations. We started leading strategy sessions side by side more often, finishing each other's sentences the way good teams eventually do. It felt efficient, natural. At least, that's what I told myself. Late meetings became normal. Sometimes the office emptied out and only a few lights remained on in the corridor. Those were the moments when conversations drifted away from campaign data and into something looser. "Do you ever sleep?" Garrett asked one evening while we reviewed analytics on my laptop. "Sleep is optional during pitch season," I replied. He laughed. "Your husband must be very patient." That word again, patient. I shrugged. He understands the job. Garrett studied me for a moment before saying quietly, "Still, not every man would." There was something in the way he said it that lingered in the room longer than it should have. I closed my laptop. "We should probably finish this tomorrow." "Probably," he agreed, but neither of us moved immediately. Eventually, we did, and nothing actually happened that night. At least, not in the way people imagine when they hear the word affair. But lines had already started blurring, and once a line begins to fade, it rarely returns to its original shape. At home, Daniel behaved exactly the way he always had. Calm, attentive, reliable. He still asked if I'd eaten dinner, still made coffee in the mornings, still left the small lamp on in the living room when he knew I'd be coming home late. The only difference was something I couldn't quite name. He seemed observant, not suspicious, just aware. Once, while I was texting Garrett about a campaign adjustment, Daniel glanced toward my phone. "Work?" he asked. "Yes," I replied quickly. He nodded and went back to reading. No interrogation. No accusations. Just quiet acceptance. And somehow that made me feel slightly uncomfortable because I realized I had started hiding things that technically weren't secrets. Small things, like how often Garrett's name appeared on my phone screen, or how sometimes our conversations had nothing to do with work anymore. One night, while I was getting ready for bed, Daniel asked casually, "Did the office move finalize yet?" "Yes," I said while removing my earrings. "Second floor of that commercial building downtown. Temporary lease while the company looks for something bigger." He nodded. "That area is growing fast." "You know the building?" "I've seen it." That was the entire conversation. Simple. Forgettable. What I didn't know at the time was that Daniel knew that building far better than I realized. Meanwhile, Garrett and I continued working together more closely. Team dinners after successful campaigns became routine. Celebratory drinks. Strategy sessions that stretched later into the night. Nothing that crossed a clear boundary, but plenty of moments that hovered right beside it. One evening, as we were leaving the office, Garrett reached out and touched my elbow lightly while we talked. It was a small gesture, friendly. But I noticed it, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I smiled. That moment lasted maybe 2 seconds, but if someone had been watching carefully, they would have noticed the familiarity, the comfort, the kind of quiet chemistry that doesn't belong between colleagues. I didn't realize someone was watching, not physically standing there, but paying attention from somewhere much closer than I imagined. Because while I was telling myself nothing inappropriate had happened, Daniel had already begun noticing patterns. Late nights, small changes in my tone during phone calls, the way my voice softened when certain names appeared. And Daniel was not the type of man who reacted emotionally when something felt wrong. He observed. He waited. He collected information. I didn't know any of that. I just continued living inside the version of reality that felt convenient until the night everything finally collided. The night at Bel Air. The dinner I thought would strengthen my image in front of my team. The dinner where my husband calmly revealed he was far more powerful than anyone in that room had ever imagined. What I didn't understand then was that the dinner wasn't just about revealing Daniel's identity. It was something much more deliberate, much more controlled. By the time that evening arrived, Daniel already knew far more about my life than I knew about his. And he had quietly decided that the truth was going to come out. Not in a private argument, not behind closed doors, but in front of the very people whose respect mattered most to me. After the dinner at Bel Air, something invisible but undeniable changed in my life. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But like a crack slowly spreading through glass. At first, it appeared in the smallest ways. The following Monday, when I walked into the office, 2 junior analysts stopped talking mid-sentence when they saw me. That wasn't unusual by itself. Offices are full of half-finished conversations. But there was something about the way they looked at me afterward. Curiosity, not admiration. Curiosity, the same look people give when they discover a piece of information that doesn't match the story they thought they knew. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. Emails. Meeting requests. Campaign updates. Everything looked normal, but something beneath the surface had shifted. My assistant Megan entered my office holding a tablet. "You have a call with the Westbridge client in 10 minutes, she said. Then she hesitated. Also, people are still talking about the Bel Air dinner. I kept my expression neutral. Talking about what? She gave a small, careful smile. Your husband. Of course they were. By lunchtime, I had heard Daniel's name mentioned in 3 separate conversations. One colleague leaned over during a meeting and whispered, "I had no idea your husband was involved with Bel Air." Another said, "Someone told me he helped finance their entire renovation after that fire years ago." And later that afternoon, a senior strategist asked casually, "Does Daniel consult for other hospitality properties?" I answered politely. Vaguely, the way Daniel always had. But inside, something was twisting uncomfortably. Because the truth was, I didn't actually know. I had never asked. And now that people were asking me, I suddenly realized how little I could say with confidence. The situation became even more uncomfortable 2 days later, when my boss asked me to stop by his office. He didn't bother with small talk. "Close the door," he said. I sat down across from him. He opened a folder on his desk. We've started preliminary discussions with the Bel Air group, he said. My stomach tightened slightly. For what? Potential partnership work, he replied. Brand positioning, marketing strategy, expansion support. He paused and looked at me carefully. Your husband may be involved. I blinked. I don't really know the details of his investments. My boss leaned back in his chair. That's surprising. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried a quiet weight. You're one of our most senior brand strategists, he continued, and your husband appears to be a major investor in a hospitality group we might soon work with. He folded his hands together. It would help if you had some insight into that. I forced a calm smile. I can ask him. But the truth was, the idea of asking Daniel suddenly made me uneasy, because the more people spoke about him, the clearer it became that he had been operating in a world I knew almost nothing about. Later that evening, I came home to find him sitting in the living room reading. Long day? He asked. Always, I replied, dropping my bag on the chair. I hesitated before speaking again. People at the office have been talking about Bel Air. He turned a page in his book. I'm not surprised. They seem to think you're more involved than I realized. Daniel looked up at me then. Not defensive, not proud, just calm. What exactly do they think? That you helped save the restaurant after the fire, I said. That you're part of the investor group. He studied my face for a moment. Those things are true. The simplicity of the answer irritated me more than it should have. You never told me any of this. His eyebrow lifted slightly. I mentioned the renovation project years ago. I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it again, because suddenly I remembered vague conversations, things he had said casually while we were eating dinner or driving somewhere, conversations I had half listened to before redirecting the topic back to my work. Daniel watched the realization cross my face. You weren't very interested at the time, he said quietly. I crossed my arms. You could have explained it better. He closed his book. Victoria, you once told me my projects sounded boring. The memory hit me immediately. I had said that. Not cruelly. Just dismissively. I didn't respond. Daniel stood up and walked toward the kitchen. I assumed you preferred focusing on your career, he added. I do, I said defensively. I know. His tone wasn't mocking. That somehow made it worse. The conversation ended there, but the tension stayed. Meanwhile, something else was unfolding at the office. Garrett and I were still working together constantly, but after the Bel Air dinner, people started noticing us more. Not just our work, our proximity. The way we stood close during meetings, the way we finished each other's sentences, the way we lingered in the hallway after everyone else had left. At first, I told myself the attention was harmless, but the truth was that once people start watching, they see more than you expect. And somewhere outside my awareness, another set of eyes was watching even more closely. Because Daniel owned the building where our office had recently relocated, and inside that building were security cameras. Cameras that had been installed years earlier during renovations. Cameras that quietly recorded the hallways outside my office. One late night, Daniel logged into that system. He didn't do it dramatically. No anger, no emotional outburst, just quiet curiosity. The first video clip appeared on his screen. Timestamp, 11:17 p.m. The hallway outside my office. Two figures walking toward the stairwell. One tall, one unmistakably me. Garrett's hand briefly resting on the small of my back. A moment of closeness. A gesture that didn't belong between colleagues. Daniel watched silently. Then another clip. Different night, same hallway. This time I reached up and adjusted Garrett's tie while we laughed about something off camera. Another clip, another night. Late again. We exited the office together. My hair down, his jacket over his shoulder. Too comfortable. Too familiar. There was no audio. No dramatic kiss caught on camera. Just a pattern. Repeated closeness. Repeated late nights, enough to erase any remaining doubt. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't confront me. Instead, he downloaded the videos, organized them carefully. 8 clips. 8 separate confirmations that the distance between us had grown into something far more dangerous. He saved them onto a small flash drive, placed it inside his desk drawer, and then he waited. Not to argue, not to accuse, but to choose the exact moment when the truth would no longer belong only to us. Because if I had spent years building my career around image and perception, Daniel was about to show me what happens when the narrative slips out of your control. And the night he chose to reveal everything would be the same restaurant dinner where I believed I was still the one running the show. The night Daniel exposed everything at Bel Air did not explode the way scandals usually do. There was no shouting, no glass breaking, no dramatic confrontation, just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. When the projection screen went dark, the entire room sat frozen. My boss stared at the empty wall where the footage had just played. Garrett looked like someone had suddenly drained the color from his body. And I couldn't breathe. At first, my brain refused to process what I had just seen. The hallway, the timestamps, the unmistakable silhouette of my own body leaning closer to Garrett. Moments I had dismissed as harmless suddenly looked very different when viewed from the outside, from Daniel's perspective, from my colleague's perspective, from the perspective of a room full of witnesses. My hands were shaking under the table. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Daniel took a calm sip of wine. "A reminder," he said quietly, "that buildings sometimes have cameras." The sentence landed like a physical blow. I looked around the table desperately. No one would meet my eyes. Garrett cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Daniel, this is wildly inappropriate." Daniel turned his head slightly toward him. "Inappropriate?" His tone wasn't angry. It was almost curious. "You're right," Daniel continued. "Late-night meetings with married colleagues often are." Garrett's jaw tightened. It wasn't what it looked like. Daniel gave a faint smile. "That's the interesting thing about video." He placed his napkin carefully on the table. "It usually looks exactly like what it is." No one spoke after that. Dinner ended without ceremony. People stood slowly. Chairs scraped the floor. My boss muttered something about needing fresh air before leaving the table. Garrett walked out without saying goodbye. And suddenly, the restaurant that had felt like a stage for my professional image just an hour earlier now felt like a courtroom. I didn't remember the drive home. I only remember standing in our hallway, staring at Daniel while the front door clicked shut behind us. "You humiliated me," I said. My voice sounded distant, unsteady. Daniel loosened his tie. "No," he replied calmly. "I clarified something." "Clarified?" I snapped. "You played surveillance footage in front of my boss." He walked past me toward the kitchen. "Yes. That's not clarification. That's revenge." Daniel poured himself a glass of bourbon. "I'm not angry enough for revenge." His calmness was unbearable. "You planned that entire dinner," I said. "Yes." "You invited my team." "Yes." "You arranged the projection." "Yes." Each answer landed with the same controlled precision, like he had already rehearsed this conversation. "You could have talked to me privately," I whispered. Daniel turned to face me. "I did try." "When?" "Every time I told you about something happening in my life, and you changed the subject back to your job." I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came, because somewhere deep down, I knew there was truth in what he was saying. For years, Daniel had quietly supported everything I did, every promotion, every late night, every networking event where I introduced him like an accessory to my career. And now that the power dynamic had shifted, I suddenly wanted his discretion, his protection, his silence. "You've destroyed my reputation," I said finally. Daniel studied me carefully. "No." He set his glass on the counter. "You did that." The words cut deeper than any accusation. I sank onto the couch, pressing my hands against my temples. My entire body felt like it was collapsing inward. "Why would you do this to me?" I whispered. Daniel's voice was soft. "Because you stopped seeing me a long time ago." The room went quiet. The truth of that sentence hung in the air like something too heavy to move. For the first time in years, I looked at my husband without the filter of my own ambition. And what I saw was a man who had been standing beside me for 7 years, watching me slowly treat him like background furniture in my life. A man who had supported my career while I quietly replaced him with someone else's attention. Garrett. The thought of his name now made my stomach twist, because suddenly I realized something terrifying. Garrett hadn't lost anything tonight. He would move on to another company, another city, Another opportunity. But Daniel had been my foundation, and I had shattered it. I didn't mean for things to go that far, I said quietly. Daniel didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded distant. That's the problem. What is? You never meant anything. He looked at me the way someone looks at a stranger they used to know. That's why it happened. And in that moment, sitting in our living room, surrounded by the life we had built together, I understood something that terrified me more than the humiliation at Bel Air. Daniel wasn't angry. He was finished. And there is nothing more final than someone who has quietly decided they no longer believe in you. The days after the Bel Air dinner felt unreal, not dramatic, not explosive, just different. At first, I convinced myself the damage was limited to embarrassment. Corporate environments move quickly. Scandals fade when new projects appear. People get distracted. That was the narrative I clung to, until Monday morning. At 9:07 a.m., my assistant Megan knocked on my office door with a strange look on her face. "You might want to listen to this voicemail," she said. She placed her tablet on my desk and pressed play. The voice belonged to a client we had been negotiating with for weeks, a major lifestyle brand that was supposed to sign a partnership contract worth millions in campaign work. The message was short, professional, cold. After reviewing recent developments, we've decided to pause discussions regarding the partnership. We have concerns about internal leadership stability. The call ended. Just like that. No argument, no negotiation, just gone. My stomach dropped. "Did they say what developments?" I asked quietly. Megan hesitated. "No," she said. But we both knew exactly what it meant. Bel Air. The footage, the whispers that had spread across corporate group chats faster than I could imagine. Within 30 minutes, my boss called me into his office. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse, which somehow made it worse. He simply closed the door and said, "Sit down." I obeyed. He leaned forward on his desk. "You know what clients hate more than failure?" I didn't answer. "Surprises," he said calmly. His eyes locked onto mine. "They don't like discovering personal scandals in the middle of business negotiations." I swallowed hard. "It wasn't a scandal." He raised an eyebrow. "A video of 2 senior employees behaving inappropriately inside company offices tends to qualify." The word inappropriate sounded almost polite compared to the humiliation I felt. "We were working late," I said weakly. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. Because we both knew how it looked. "I'm not firing you," he continued. Relief flickered for half a second. Then he added, "But the executive director promotion we discussed last quarter is..." Paused. Corporate language for gone. "For how long?" I asked. He sighed. "Until people stop talking about this." And people weren't stopping. Over the next few days, the changes were subtle but unmistakable. Meetings I used to lead were reassigned. Clients began speaking directly with other executives instead of me. Emails that once copied me automatically stopped including my name. No one confronted me openly, but the shift in perception was unmistakable. My authority had cracked. And in corporate environments, perception is everything. Garrett disappeared even faster. On Wednesday morning, an internal email announced he had been transferred to the Denver office, effective immediately. No explanation, no farewell meeting, no goodbye drinks, just gone. When I read the message, my chest tightened unexpectedly. Not because I loved him, but because the entire situation suddenly felt painfully clear. Garrett had been an opportunity, a distraction, but he was never the person whose life would collapse from this. That role belonged to me. When I arrived home that night, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen counter, drinking coffee. "You heard?" I asked. He looked up from his book. "Heard what?" "Garrett was transferred." Daniel nodded slowly. "That seems practical." I stared at him. "That's all you have to say? What else would you like me to say?" "That you ruined my career!" Daniel closed the book calmly. "I didn't make you stay late with him." I felt heat rush to my face. "You showed those videos to my entire team." "No," he corrected quietly. "I showed them the truth." "That's not the same thing. It is when the truth is inconvenient." His composure was infuriating. "Do you enjoy this?" I asked. "Watching everything fall apart?" Daniel shook his head. "No." He stood up slowly. "I'm just watching the consequences catch up to the story you built." "What story?" He looked directly into my eyes, the one where I didn't matter. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been haunting me since Bel Air. "How long did you know?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "A while." "And you said nothing?" I was deciding whether it was worth saving. My chest tightened. "And?" His expression didn't change. "That decision has already been made." It took me a moment to understand what he meant. Then the weight of it hit me. "You're leaving," I whispered. Daniel didn't respond with anger or bitterness, just quiet certainty. "Yes." And in that moment, I realized something that finally broke through the defensive walls I had built around myself. The dinner at Bel Air, the videos, the humiliation, none of it had been the real turning point. The real turning point had happened long before that. The moment Daniel stopped believing our marriage was worth protecting. And by the time I realized it, it was already too late. By the following week, the situation finally had a name. Not scandal. Not affair. Corporate language is always more precise and colder than that. The phrase circulating quietly through the company was reputational risk. It appeared first in an internal memo from senior leadership, then in whispered conversations near the elevators. Then, in the subtle way, people started adjusting their distance from me during meetings. Reputational risk. A phrase that sounds harmless until you realize it means people no longer trust you to represent them. The first visible consequence had already happened, the lost client, but more followed. Within days, 2 smaller accounts requested different points of contact. Nothing dramatic, just polite emails thanking me for previous work, while asking if another executive could handle future communications. Translation: we don't want our brand associated with whatever happened. My assistant Megan stopped lingering in my office to chat the way she used to. She remained professional, efficient, polite, but the warmth was gone. Even my boss behaved differently. Not hostile, just cautious, as if standing too close to me might damage his own reputation. The office environment I had spent years mastering suddenly felt unfamiliar. Rooms that once grew quiet when I entered, because people respected my authority, now grew quiet for a completely different reason, because they were wondering what I might say next, or whether I might become the next topic of conversation after they left. Meanwhile, Garrett was gone, transferred to Denver with corporate efficiency. No goodbye, no apology, no message. And the strangest part was that I didn't even feel angry at him, because Garrett had never promised me anything. The person who had promised me something was Daniel, and I had been the one to break that. At home, the atmosphere had changed just as dramatically, but in a completely different way. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't taunt me. He simply withdrew. The house we shared began feeling like 2 separate worlds occupying the same space. He woke earlier than I did, left before I finished breakfast. Sometimes I didn't see him until late evening. When we did cross paths, the conversations were short, practical, detached. Mail arrived. There's leftover pasta in the fridge. I'll be out tonight. No accusations, no arguments. And somehow that silence hurt far more than shouting ever could have. One evening I found him in the living room reviewing paperwork. "What is that?" I asked. "Legal documents," he replied. My stomach tightened. "Divorce papers?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he nodded once. "Yes." The word felt like it physically knocked the air out of my chest. "You already filed?" 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks? I repeated. That was before Bel Air. The realization hit me slowly. "You had already decided." "Yes." "And you still invited my team to that dinner?" Daniel met my eyes calmly. "You said you wanted me to be more visible." His tone carried no sarcasm, just quiet accuracy. I sank onto the couch. "So that was your way of revealing everything?" "No," he said. "That was your way of seeing the truth in front of witnesses." I rubbed my temples. "You could have destroyed me completely." Daniel looked almost puzzled. "I didn't." "You showed surveillance footage in front of my boss." "And yet you still have your job." I couldn't argue with that, because he was right. Daniel had been ruthless in exposing the truth, But he hadn't crossed certain lines. He hadn't leaked the footage publicly. He hadn't sent it to media outlets. He hadn't tried to ruin my life completely. He had simply stopped protecting the illusion I had built. And once that illusion shattered, the consequences followed naturally. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I said quietly. Daniel studied me. "I believe you." "Then why can't we fix this?" He sighed softly. "Because the problem isn't the affair." I frowned. "Then what is it?" "The fact that you stopped seeing me as a person." His voice remained calm. "You turned me into a supporting character in your life." "That's not true," I protested weakly. "Victoria," he said gently, "you once introduced me at a company event as my husband, Daniel. He keeps things running at home while I run the world." I remembered that moment. It had been meant as a joke. Everyone had laughed. Daniel hadn't. "I thought you understood the humor," I whispered. I understood the truth behind it. Silence filled the room again. The weight of 7 years of marriage hung between us. Finally, Daniel stood. "I'm not trying to punish you," he said. "I'm just done pretending our relationship was equal." He picked up his coat. "I'll be staying at the Bel Air property for a few weeks while the legal process moves forward." "You're leaving tonight?" I asked. "Yes." My throat tightened. "Daniel, please." He paused near the door, not turning around. "I did love you," he said quietly. Past tense. That was the word that finally broke something inside me. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. And just like that, the house that had once felt like the center of my life became painfully empty. The last time I saw Daniel wasn't in a courtroom. It wasn't during the divorce signing. And it wasn't during one of the quiet legal meetings where lawyers spoke in calm, emotionless language about dividing property and closing accounts. It happened months later. At Bel Air, I hadn't planned to go there. In fact, for a long time, I avoided that entire neighborhood. The memory of that dinner, the moment my entire professional image cracked open in front of my own team, still lingered like an echo I couldn't silence. But one evening after work, something pulled me there. Maybe curiosity, maybe unfinished emotion, maybe the quiet realization that running from places doesn't erase the choices you made inside them. When I walked into the restaurant, the host greeted me politely and led me to a small table near the kitchen. Not the mezzanine. That space, I now understood, had never been mine. For years I had believed I was the center of every room I entered, the leader, the success story, the person everyone watched. But sitting there alone, listening to plates clatter in the kitchen and glasses clink at nearby tables, I realized something painful. Success doesn't mean much when you forget the people who stood beside you before you had it. Halfway through my meal, I looked up and saw him. Daniel was seated on the mezzanine level above the main floor, the same quiet corner he had always preferred. Marco stood beside him, pouring espresso, while they discussed something that looked like architectural plans spread across the table. For a moment, our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us waved. Daniel simply raised his glass slightly, not in mockery, not in forgiveness, just acknowledgement. A recognition of two people who once built a life together and then watched it fall apart, piece by piece. I lowered my gaze and stared at the empty chair across from me. Once upon a time, Daniel would have been sitting there, listening, supporting, believing in me, and I had treated that loyalty like background noise. When I finally left the restaurant, the night air felt strangely clear. Painful, yes, but honest. The truth is, I didn't lose my marriage because of one mistake. I lost it because of years of small dismissals. Because I stopped being curious about the man who loved me. Because I assumed he would always remain quietly behind me while I chased the spotlight. But the people who stand quietly beside you are often the ones holding the entire stage together. And the moment you forget that, the spotlight stops feeling like success. It starts feeling like exposure. Sometimes the most painful lesson in life isn't losing someone. It's realizing they were the most valuable thing you had long before you understood their worth.